The music roadmap gives us information about what the music itself, once read and played, might not completely tell us, or is it a suggestion for those for whom it doesn't speak directly? Is it a redundancy, or is it a necessary explanation of the direction in which the performer has to direct their, I would say, imagination? You can call it inspiration. But the precision of the indication is a very interesting element to be taken in account. For instance, repeat signs, were they only there for the structural organization of groupments of bars for the proportions of the edifice that was constructed formally, which might have been already back in the past when we didn't have recordings of their performances respected, or partially, or none, or totally. And not necessarily for, if the repeat is taken, to be different in its way to be presented dynamically for the modern instrument, or articulation wise for the instruments before the dynamics instruments of the keyboard, like the piano. These speculations are unnecessary ultimately because we have to play with the instrument for which we play, through which we play, the music which is timeless. But nevertheless, if the composer wrote repeats, it might have been for convenience, or not only for structural proportions, but also why not develop 8 bars of a musical thought rather than restate it? And there is a virtue in the restatements in the music of the Romantic era that is different from the restatement of the classical or the Baroque era. One is more organization of the thought. Another one is more a term of endearment or insistence, or perhaps a sense of echo cell, as I like to call it later in Debussy, for instance, where the restatement echoes what you heard first, as if the first hearing of it, or when it appears by the performer, it creates such an amazement or surprise, of course, within the context of the time frame, which today might not be so audacious after a certain evolution of the rapport of consonance and dissonance in the future from the past, and the tonal centered versus the hierarchy of the tonal system, and all the organizations into atonalism or post-tonalism. Therefore, the audacity of some modulations might fade, so to say, even if we try to compartmentalize our understanding of the music of the time period in which we navigate, from the point of view of the composer's view of the musical language, the syntax, the grammar, the harmony, the melody, the contrapoint, the polyphony, the secondary voices, the development or partially so of the themes, motifs that are not developed, themes that are developed, organization of superimposition of the thematic materials. In other words, the intellectual carburation of a composer's thought that originates in a, let's say, motivic few notes of music with rhythmic patterns eventually too. And this arborescence of the thoughts of the composer are hinted to us by more subtle things like accents, markings of breathing, or indication of dynamic range that has anti-climatic drops from rising almost, but no, to a climax which is not always attained, and how to not delay it or yes take time by adding grace notes or perhaps group of grace notes which delay an important note that has to be enunciated because it represents climatic moment either for the melodic, either for the harmonic coating of the structure of the phrase, of the arching of the statement. All these are to be taken in account because when we play from the score, we play all the details, and then once put together as a good craftsman, they constitute the whole. Except that I've noticed that when we play from memory, we have tendency to develop a view of things that brings us to be discerning of how we interiorize the thought process, developmental, formal of the composer's, let's say, structure, and how the subtle modulations or relatively long or short transitions between the elements and the times bring us to construct the statement as our own rather than a recitation, rather a paraphrase. But then again, the music score is necessarily not to be considered as a canvas or a platform which gives you a template from which you develop then your interpretation by reorganizing the patterns of the decorations or the ornamentations or the dynamic ranges, which could be then changed differently in the restatement. Now, there is also a recapitulation formally that is written out, but if you have the example of the variations, which are always following the pattern of the theme, like in the Goldberg Bach variations, you have obviously some people who take only the first, some people who take both, some who take none. And the conception of length is very relative because in the 18th century or the 21st century, the capacity of concentration or the capacity of length of staying within an austere environment of subtle changes, like actually minimalist composers do in the 20th century, or then the drastic Sturm und Drang of the Romantic era that Schubert so well personified, the storm and lightning. So either it's drastic contrast, either it's subtle contrast, but the question of the length of the proportions today could appear unbearingly long, and for some others it's considered a redundancy. After all, you can state the elements without to have to go through all the developments. Factually, when you play from memory, you assimilate, you digest, you have already understood the arching of the phrasing of the way the statement is displayed by the composer, but because you don't read it in real time, the roadmap of the markings of the composer is internalized in the performance and eventually evolves in time with your own views of how to manage the pulse, the tempo change, how much is poco, how much is piu, how much is etwas, like the Germans write somewhat allegro or somewhat andante, how to evaluate the pace compared to the pulse, compared to the mood, compared to the character, compared to the instrument, the acoustics. All these are so many aspects that you have to take in account, but in the spontaneity of the flow, in the performance, integrate from the read to the apparently improvised, which is not. But you have to appear like you're restating it, even if you're true to each line of the written text, like actors when they deliver their lines. But in the sense of believability that what they say is what comes from them, even because they embody the characters that who speak through them, the text that the writers convey to us about the character of the heroes of the storytelling. And in music, it's all, especially without lyrics, it's all hinted through the interval gestures, harmonic colors, effects, moods, atmospheres, suggestive psychologies of delayed resolutions with suspensions, appoggiaturas, lingering dissonances until expected consonances, or syncopated harmonic under. Under energy, bit like in Schumann's music very often. And so you're placed in a situation where the grammar and the culture and the syntax of a given composer might imply that you need to play the repeat, and not necessarily differently, because you might think that in today's ears, outside of the context of the, let's say, 18th or 17th or 19th centuries ears or psyches of the listeners, they would not mind longer redundancy. Today, we try to think that we might have to do something different. So I still think that we need to respect the text for what it is, and if we serve it, we have to serve it for what we think it is. Now, not necessarily everybody agrees of what exactly its sense is, what its meaning is, but at least there is a sense of respect towards the idea that not all the notations are only, let's say, suggestive or imposing to us, or that we can bypass some because we gain time if we don't have it in the performance. That is, for juries, auditions, exams, very often the case, which I regret personally. But then when a performer plays with the repeats, it sounds almost unnatural. It's like wearing clothes that are like in Mardi Gras instead of everyday musical clothes, the harmonic clothing, and the way of the melodic line statement. I won't do the repeat today. How do we integrate it in the narrative statement, and not only in the do I do it or not factually for being respectful or disrespectful, with or good bad arguments about both options. The teacher is here a hyphen between the composer's intent through the filter of the notation and the roadmap of the music score, and then the student, and the recordings available to more than ever today to compare how people approached these facts in the past when they performed it. And the same piece can mean so many different things, but as well as there are possibly seasons through lives of performers where the music expression of the piece evolves as well. So in this plethora of options, you have to go down to the analytical understanding of what it is meaningfully telling you through the form, through the restatements, repeated or rewritten, in terms of developed in the score, and then how you manage that statement, avoiding the easy boredom or surprise antagonistic options, because I think neither nor are necessarily good advisors. It's more about the thought development processes that you narrate through the composer's idea, through your playing and your psyche and your emotion, and how you vibrate emotionally and intellectually to it, towards the listeners who, either if informed, disagree with you because they have an opinion, either if they receive it without prior knowledge, then adhere or don't adhere intuitively to your narrative storytelling. But the roadmaps are written signs there to give you this intensity of seeing, okay, if it's andante, it's not adagio, walking or taking the time. If it's a di molto, a lot, or sometimes it's a contradictory indication to avoid exaggerations, allegro ma non troppo, lively, driven, soulful, but not too much. as if we want to give some kind of a censorship to ourselves by the indication of the tempo until the objectivity of the 1815 marketed metronome invention already earlier so, but marketed in Vienna by Melzel, where the beats per minute are the defined factor. But then again, you find that composers mark tempi that are not necessarily the ones that the performer might take. I think there is also room for interpretation there, for translation or understanding of what are they hinting. If it's a cut time in the meter instead of a 4/4, and you see a andante, or you see an adagio with a cut time, in other words, the choice of the values, the notation of the rhythmic values versus the shape of group of bars for the hypermeter, or how you notate if you subdivide slow movements with fast rhythms that are played slowly, and how that implies to your subconscious first reading of like seeing 30 seconds played slowly or half notes played fast, because of the indication of the tempo with number of beats a minute, or just the Italian, German, French, or whichever language of the composer sometimes indication is in. And how we compare it to orchestral treatment of the same tempi of the same composer, operatic, and how do we compare it to the chamber music, and of course the instrumental bow breath for the singer, length of the bow of the wind player also, of course, for the breath intake, determine the tempi more physiologically than only intellectually, as the pianists tend to do with the longer decay of the sound than the harpsichord, and with the pedal even longer, which could imply slower tempi than the natural tempo that would have been taken for the same piece a century or two before on a fortepiano or an earlier instrument. One could state, as I do purposely here, so many of the elements for the food of thought, for thought of the choices that we ultimately make analytically from understanding what the notation or the filter of the notation hints to us about the intent of the composer, even if it's not reached by us, or even if it's possibly betrayed by us performers when we do perform the piece, thinking it as a composer, thinking with outside the box or within the box, regardless, we have to, we bring it alive from the text that is notated only. And therefore, that element of bringing alive could betray it or enhance it, or give it another point of view which could be rejected even by the composer, or considered, if the composer is still alive, as a valuable other point of view they didn't conceive. I think it's very healthy to rethink the paradigm, not that we are by obligation to question the veracity of what we are taught to read, like, is a grace not always half of the value? Is the fermata always double of the value? Yes and no. It depends of the context. Do you always or not consider it so? And if it's Haydn, is it Schubert? If a fermata is in Mendelssohn or in Chopin or in Prokofiev, the context of the style dictates us differently. And of course, recordings of people who knew the composer or the composer themselves give us an authenticity which not necessarily matches our inspiration of their music, saying, oh, I love it my way, rather than the composer's way, even if we don't want to betray the composer's wish. After all, we're not delay spokesmen beyond time frames of them. We are only responding to what it means to us, the impression, the profound, deep philosophical meaning that their work produces on us. And when we translate it to our audiences, it's the fruit of our experience of life, of our experience of the style, of our experience of other styles, of how we put it in context, how we deal with the uncharted part of the roadmap, which is also our responsibility as well as our uh, fancy, without that to appear superficial, because ultimately we have to be convincing because we are convinced, and therefore it has to be at all levels um, um, a straight from the heart statement, even if it's filtered through the mind, and repeatedly practiced until we find what at best we can bring out of it beyond the technical difficulties and the hurdles to evacuate before we can state it freely one way or the other, or evolve within the ways of stating it. Thank you.